All right. Welcome back, everybody. Wow, it must be week 5 in the semester. I can already feel it. Just feel that in the air, right? Starting to be draggy a little bit. Things are getting... Anyway. Let's see, where do I want to start? Last week we spent a little time talking about 1 Samuel 15. I hope we're all still friends. You can blame somebody in the class today for asking me the question originally. He's come back, so no, I'm just kidding. No, what I want us to do, what I'm going to do this week is post our first official extra credit opportunity. So I figure while the iron is still hot, some of you were able to maybe articulate a little bit of your thoughts in response in the discussion group question, which was posted from last week's in-class discussion, trying to bring a little application to it. But if you want to get back into that conversation, exercises like this help us to kind of consolidate some of our thinking. What I've done is I've been emailing back and forth this last week with a student who had very specific questions about my presentation on 1 Samuel 15 and the particular way that I did it through the lens of the atonement. And this got into the whole conversation of the atonement, unlimited, limited, and some of the other elements of the well-known tulip equation that talks about, total depravity and unconditional election and limited atonement. So that's that Reformed or Calvinistic position, bringing together some of the aspects. And, that's kind of a hot topic these days. I don't know if you've caught that or not. Is that putting it lightly? It's a hot topic, yeah. Yeah, it is a hot topic, okay. And I know it's a hot topic with the churches that we are serving. So here's the deal for extra credit. What I'm going to do is post, with his permission, he's given it to me already, post that conversation, the back and forth exchange that I've had with that one student, and that I want you to do as an extra credit is interject your own thoughts in response and at appropriate places in a different color of font ink so that I can see what you're saying in response to the student who's, his words will be in black and my words will be in red or green, and I'll tell you what how to change font color and add that to a Word document. It's just a right click and whatever. So maybe I'll show you a screenshot. But what do you think about that? Would that be fun? You don't have to do it because it's extra credit. But if you do it, my extra credits for that one, I'll give you kind of an approximate word length, will be 10 points. That makes up for a lost group discussion. So that's what I'll do. So that way, if you want to do that, you don't have to, but some of you might be motivated because you've been thinking about this and maybe talking about it with friends and say, hey, this professor said this, what do you think of that? All that stuff. This is the time, by the way, in our ministry preparation where we ought to have conversations like this. And this is a fair topic to kind of, if I'm pushing you a little bit, that's okay because you're master's level students. And this is a topic that I'd really encourage you to kind of try to solidify some of your thoughts. I mean, a lot of the students this week emailed me and said, yeah, this is a relevant topic. I was talking to congregation members just this last week about this topic. And it's not going anyway anytime soon. It's probably going to be a hot topic this summer at the Southern Baptist Convention, so as well. So it's become a political topic as well. So anyway, enough said on that. Let's go ahead and get started in prayer. I promise today I won't bring up many controversial topics again, but maybe later in the semester I will, just for fun. You don't believe me? All right. I got a wedding this Saturday. I don't know. I'd asked for prayer. I'm officiating my son's wedding, and it's going to be a glorious, grand day if I can just get through it without bawling my eyes out. And it's my second wedding I've done. I did my brother's wedding, which was a lot different. It was on the beach. We did a sand ceremony and some of this newfangled stuff. But this is going to be an old school traditional wedding with the traditional vows and all of that. So I'll pray for myself on that one. All right, well, let's go to the Lord in prayer, and we'll get started. Gracious Heavenly Father, we do praise you. We praise you for your grace. And Lord, as we see and remind ourselves today, as we wrap up the Davidic covenant, some of the eternal promises that were made to the King David through the prophet Nathan that extend our future into time that has not yet come about. and we look forward to the day of the Lord. We look forward to your coming again, the establishment of your kingdom and your throne, that you'll rule and extend life and blessing to all of the nations of the world. And it'll be a far different time and a far different cry, a cry from our current situation where we've got conflict and wars and rumors of wars and all of these things that are happening in the headlines. We trust you because you are sovereign over all, and your rulership extends across the entire planet and oversees all things seen and unseen, whether dominions or rulers or kingdoms. Lord, you rule them all. We thank you for that reminder, and we look forward to this time. Think with our hearts and our minds. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, just a few brief words where we kind of left off last week on the Davidic covenant. Kind of left you with this slide. It's kind of detailed, but it's just kind of something that you might want to log for future reference if you're ever asked a question about this again. Where the promises come from in the actual verse or Nathan's oracle. And what's on that far right column was my attempt to kind of make the connections with what David would have known before, or would have already been known with regards to God's unconditional promises to his people. So we go back to places in Genesis and the Abrahamic covenant, or that ongoing covenant that gets repeated, and we see that, we trace that through the patriarchal history. And the V19 is verse 19 out of 2 Samuel 7. And that's David's words that you see there, where he talks about all of this he recognizes concerning the distant future. That's verse 19. So the distant future, you might think of that in terms of these things. If these things are the known things, because they go back to previous verses, what I maybe failed to say last week is that the V19, verse 19 promises are, you might think of that as new information, or maybe recast truth that's kind of pointing ahead to the future. So the things like, this eternal house, that Yahweh's going to build a house for David, and the establishment of the forever kingdom, the establishment of the everlasting covenant, and the forever kingdom and throne. All of those are the future things. So that's kind of new information. And that's the significance that I was trying to make last week. And that's this slide here that kind of drops in the Davidic covenant in a way that kind of reminds us and points back to a few of those places. This doesn't offer all the details, but here I'm framing this with regards to our conversation on the bookends idea. So the big picture of what we call, salvation history, the beginning and the end. Those are the ideas of the one king, one name, and when is it going to be that God's promise to extend life and blessing to all the nations of the world? When's that going to be, right? Well, that's going to be the day of the Lord when it comes, but the Davidic covenant is going to package that up and point it in the right direction. So past, present, and future with regards to. And these are the things I've made the case before that are true, past, present, and future, because they're extensions from eternal reality, right? God as king. So this is earthly expression of an eternal reality. God is king, his one name or his reputation. Our job to, bear that name or bear that image, and the extension of life and blessing. So when the day of the Lord is the day when all of this reality intersects time and space and comes to us. New heaven, new earth, and all of those things that we talk about in those other classes, systematic theology and eschatology and end time stuff, right? We'll get to that when we get to the prophets. All right, anybody questions on that? Everything's pretty clear on that before we move on? All right, good? All right, let's move on now and finish 2 Samuel and get going on Kings here really quick. Let's see here. So we're back to David, and what we're going to see here beginning in chapter 8 is David's going to establish himself early on here as a Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20 kind of king. And in 2 Samuel 8 here, it's going to focus here on some of his early military victories. And you might think of David as continuing the to finish the unfinished business of the unconquered nations left over, even through that 400-year period of the book of Judges. But this early success, in chapter 8, I want to look at some of these details here a little bit about sorry, I don't want to go that far. Not yet, anyway. Chapter 8, beginning in verse 13. Everybody look there. It looks to me, and I might be wrong on this, I haven't checked all the commentaries, but that the author here might be giving us some advance notice with regards to King David. Yes, even King David, we've argued, he's the wholehearted king. And here we have in verse 13, so David made a name for himself when he returned from killing 18,000 Arameans in the Valley of Salt. So, yeah, well, that's okay, right? What gets my attention is this, making a name for yourself. That sounds like an echo from Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel episode, where in defiance, the people say there, in that context, come, let us make for ourselves a name. Name means, the idea of, well, whose name are you bearing or carrying or representing? So bearing the name, we've argued before, is the name Yahweh. Yahweh is going to be front and center. But what's David doing bearing for himself or building for himself a name? So that might be a little bit of a warning, kind of an advanced shot. Still, though, we have to balance that, though you see it in verse 14, and he put garrisons in Edom. In all Edom he put garrisons, and all of the Edomites became servants to David. And Yahweh, the Lord, helped David wherever he went. So maybe we're okay, But let's keep going here and see what we've got here. In verse 14 and 15, we see that the Lord's involvement in all that David was doing. We see in chapter 9 a little bit of the personal side to King David in showing kindness to the remaining, some of the remaining residents of the household of Saul in 2 Samuel 9, verses 1 through 3. And this is to Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth. You got to say it, practice saying that. Verses 11 and 13, we see the kindness of David now extending and continuing to extend to the household of Saul. And his name means from the mouth of shame, so he needed a little encouragement. Finally, we see the emphasis on David's defeating the mighty Aramean army. So in chapter 10, I want to look at verses 17 through 19, or actually, let's have our first reader of the day. And I feel like an introduction is necessary. I met this student in person on the island of Cayman. He's a Caymanian. I don't know if I said that right. But he is George McCarthy, the former Prime Minister of Finance for the whole island of Cayman. Now he's semi-retired, and he's down there pursuing our Master's of Theological Studies degree as an online student. So I'd like Mr. McCarthy to read chapter 10, verses 17 through 19.
A correction, Dr. Smith, I'm not Finance Minister.
Not anymore.
You're a financial secretary, the equivalent of finance minister.
Financial minister. Okay. I sound correct. I stand corrected. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Good to hear your voice.
Thank you very much. Starting at verse 17.
Starting at 17 through verse 19.
Yes. Now when it was told David, he gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came to Elam, and the Arameans arrayed themselves to meet David and fought against him. But the Arameans fled before Israel, and David killed 700 charioteers of the Arameans and 40,000 horsemen, and struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there. When all the king's servants of Hadadezer saw that they were defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and served them. So the Arameans feared to help the sons of Ammon anymore.
All right, thank you, sir. So now what we've got, at the end of this section in chapter 10, we've seen a lot of focus here on the exploits, the military exploits, the victories that David has here, and early success. Now, I'm doing a careful reading here, and I might be, like I said last week, and I wasn't trying to be mean, but the author here might be giving us, I think, some possible clues, some signals. And here in this particular text, we see the emphasis on David. And you see it there in verse 17. David gathered together and crossed over, verse 17. Verses 18, David killed 700 charioteers. And we don't see the emphasis there on the Lord. The Lord didn't give the victory. The Lord is not mentioned in this particular text, as this particular passage ends up here. Maybe a little bit too much emphasis on David. I don't know. It's the work of interpretation at this point. None of us are going to necessarily agree. David's the wholehearted king, but what's he doing here? What's the author telling us here? So we get to the end of chapter 10 and verse 19, and like I say, it seems like there's a shift. We didn't see what the author said earlier in chapter 8. The Lord, we didn't see any reference there to, and the Lord helped David wherever he went. And that was mentioned a couple of times. We're not seeing that phrase here. That's my only point. All right, enough said on that. And the reason I'm thinking this, because, when we read a book like 1 Samuel, we just keep reading through the chapter breaks. The author is not necessarily making some kind of break in thought. It's a continuous narrative. So we keep reading, and he's building us up to a real pivotal point in the king's life, King David. So I think that's what might be. We're going to see, some of this some of the color start to fill in with regards to, I think, what the author is building us up for, and that's what we have in chapter 11. The extra details that we are given here, I think, lead us to the idea. The author's pointing us to the fact that some of these details are leading up to the king's fall. So maybe a little bit too much credit on David. And then we have the details given in verse 1 in chapter 11. Then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, extra information, right? But we have to understand the author's writing with a theological bias, or a theological purpose. Where should kings be is the question we immediately ask ourselves. Loyal kings are out on the battlefield with their troops. But here the author's giving us extra information. When the kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But it's going to make it in my book that I'm going to write someday, Big Butts of the Bible. This is one right here. But David stayed behind at Jerusalem. All right. And what we see next in verses 2 through 5, go ahead and read that. Let's see. Not here today. Let's see. I know I haven't updated my list, but you go by Will or Bill?
Thomas.
Oh, you go by Thomas. That's right. I didn't write. Yeah, I was close. But I know you're leaving early, so I have to pick on you now. So there you go. All right. So go ahead, Thomas. Go ahead and read 2 through 5 in chapter 11.
It happened late one afternoon when David rose on his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house. And he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?
Eliam. Mm-hmm.
So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived. And she sent and told David, I am pregnant.
Okay. So what we've got going on here, this happens to me every other day. I'm just kidding. This is an odd event, right? That's my point. You have to edit that out. Yeah, sorry. I said that wrong. Came out wrong. This doesn't happen. This is an unusual event. That's what I was trying to say. Yeah, okay. Even for a king, And how do we evaluate this situation? Well, we keep going, and the author's going to give us details in the text. Yeah, I know how to wake up a classroom. What is the extent of David's personal sin in this particular case, right? And remember last week I made a big deal about the difference between original sin and personal sin. David's acting, obviously, on the basis of the fact that he's an original sinner. He's taking advantage of a situation. He's thinking it through. It's calculated, and he's, acting and creating personal sin and guilt, bringing on himself in this situation. How does that look like, and what does that look like in the text? So David sent to Joab, saying, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." So Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked concerning the welfare of Joab and the people in the state of the war. Then David said to Uriah, verse 8, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Hint, hint, hint. I need a way to cover this thing up. Go down and spend some time with your wife as a baby's on the way, and the quicker we can get this thing taken care of and washed under the, swept under the rug, the better off we'll all be. You see the cover up here? And the irony here is in the act of David demonstrating disloyalty to his soldier, Uriah continues to demonstrate tremendous loyalty to his king. There's a contrast here. We'll keep reading in the text, and we've got more to say on this. Go down to your house and wash your feet. Uriah went out of the king's house, and a present from the king was sent out after him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord. He did not go down to his house. And now when they told David, saying Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "We've got to have a plan B. Have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house?" And Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in temporary shelters, and my lord Joab and the servants." So he ends up sending Uriah back to the front lines, where there's more of an opportunity for soldiers to die in battle. So what we have here is, if we map this out for David, I just say a few things with regards to David acting here. David's going to demonstrate covenant infidelity to the Lord by obviously violating one of the 10 commandments, committing adultery. David's going to demonstrate disloyalty to his soldiers, his troops, the army back in the battlefield by staying in Jerusalem. He's demonstrating disloyalty to Uriah in this particular case, so it's on multiple levels. We've got David here showing up, demonstrating disloyalty. We can even, do a little bit of an analysis. If we go back to Deuteronomy 17, Moses' prescription for how a good king should be, is this even the evidence for David amassing women? His conquest should have been on the battlefield. Instead, now he's after a different kind of conquest. And so there's a lot of, this theme of infidelity extends not just in terms of the adultery, but now we can extend it with regards to the army and to Uriah and even taking advantage of Bathsheba and all of these things. Even in the midst of all this, Uriah is the one who's demonstrating the loyalty that we should be seeing in the king. So there's this intersection of it's a closely written narrative, but the author is allowing this to scream off the page, you might say it that way, in terms of shocking us and getting our attention. All right. Can't be so mean to David, though. If we think about this particular event in light of my claim that David's a wholehearted king, how do we, in a sense, not necessarily smooth over the sin, but kind of clean off the heart for David? How do we show that from the text, right? Are we going to see it? Well, let's look over in the immediate context. Chapter 12, we have a visit from the prophet Nathan, the same prophet who was just delivered not too long before the Davidic covenant. And we have David here responding to his rebuke So the prophet Nathan's going to rebuke David. And then David says to Nathan in response, chapter 12, verse 13, I've sinned against the Lord. That's a whole heart shining forth. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has taken away your sin, you shall not die. However, because by this deed you have not given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also that is born to you shall surely die. So there's going to be, some divine judgment perhaps in this particular context. Nathan then goes to his house. And, there's a little bit of a revealing of a heart there in that context, but I think we can probably say more, and you probably know where I'm going with this. Remember, David's a songwriter, theological. He's like a Michael Card. He puts down good theology, good truth, but to song with the intention of conveying this theology to his kingdom. Now we have a wholehearted king. Let's turn to Psalm 51. Maybe the next day. Who knows? It's close. The kernel is still hot, and David, is writing a song here to commemorate the event for his kingdom. This is how a wholehearted king operates. This is my case. He writes, and this is in parallelism, in Hebrew parallelism. So we have this logical connection of ideas going back and forth between lines. Be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the greatness of your compassion. Blot out my transgression. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin, for I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you only I've sinned and done what is evil in thy sight, so that you are justified when you speak and blameless when you are judged. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. Behold, you desired truth in the innermost being. Restore to me the joy of thy salvation, and sustain me with a willing spirit. So this whole psalm, right, comes out of the context of what does a wholehearted king do in response to a fall? He gets up, he acknowledges his sin, and publicly, and he writes a song that conveys theological truth for his whole kingdom. People were singing this song in church as a reminder of how they're supposed to deal with sin. How do we deal with sin? Well, we follow David's example, right? That's what we do. How's that? He also writes Psalm 32, which is another psalm that may have some connections to, not particularly maybe this event, but it's also a psalm that focuses on and leads one to proper theology with regards to sin. How blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. That's the idea of the atonement. How blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. When I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night, your hand was heavy upon me. I mean, there is some real honesty, right? Coming forth from King David. He knows sin personally. He knows the consequences of sin. He's trying to say, don't, if at all possible, don't follow my example. Not only committing this kind of sin, but here's the proper response to sin when it comes your way. And, sometimes I hear people in my church say, well, no one in the Old Testament knew anything about, they were all sinners and Jesus hadn't come yet, so they didn't know what to do about it. This crazy stuff, you hear out there. Here's an example of people who, the faithful, and in this particular case, probably very much a theological, spiritual high point in the kingdom. Lots of people were knowing what to do about sin and were being instructed in how to follow through and acknowledge sin and experience forgiveness, even in the midst of and before a holy God. So that's kind of important for us to know. What does this also teach us about? I've got a little bit of an application here. When do the falls in our lives oftentimes happen? Right? When we get to a spiritual high, whatever's going on in our ministry, things are going great, and then we get back home and something happens. Sometimes we have to be careful coming off the spiritual highs. For David, it was the Davidic covenant experience, and he's kind of sitting back, taking a little vacation. and then this happens, So we have to be careful in our personal ministries to watch out for those weak times in terms of the timetable of our personal ministries. We have to be on guard all the time, especially when we are coming off of a spiritual highs. And ministry is full of them. Trust me. You probably already know that. So after David's sin over or with Bathsheba, things start to get a little bit chaotic for David. And it's interesting, theologically, I think we can say, and the author here would concur, that what we're going to see from this point, especially when we turn the corner with Solomon, is that God's promise to fulfill, or the promise to fulfill his promises, God's promises will be fulfilled to his people, with or without, or not depending on the righteousness of any earthly king. That's what I wanted to say. And I had a hard time getting it out. God's promises to his people, the faithful remnant, will come through not necessarily the righteousness of an earthly king. An earthly king, underline that. So we're going to start to see the implications of that when we get into the rest of this history of kings, all the way to the end. We're going to see what happens there. What God's going to do, we'll see in our third semester OT survey. God's going to raise up prophets to remind the people of this point. We're looking ahead to a time when one other king's going to come. On the foundation of what Nathan promises to King David, there's going to be another Messiah king who's going to come and bring about some of the fulfillment of these promises. And what will be unique about that king will be an interesting revelation. He's not only going to be an earthly king, but God himself will come as king. It's going to be the new thing as we look ahead. So anyway, let's see here. We can turn ahead. I guess I had a little reference here to... I'm sorry. Do I want to get into this? Well, maybe we can link it to what Paul writes with regards to... let's turn to Romans chapter 5. I was trying to make a little theological connection there. And this kind of builds on what we talked about last week with regards to the atonement. But in Romans chapter 5, and I guess the... okay. I think I know what happened. Sorry. What I say here, I just wanted to write this down and make sure I say it correctly. Unless the iniquity of humanity is placed on him, all iniquity on all humanity. Gosh, I'm a little... I tried to get this down, but now it's not coming out. So let's look at Romans chapter 5, verse 17 and 18. Paul writes, "For if by the transgression of the one death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness will reign in the life through the one, namely Jesus Christ. So then, as through the one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so through one act of righteousness there resulted justification of life to all men." So that idea of the atonement as it extends. So I guess what I was thinking there, the significance of this king to come, this coming king, is that God's fullness of his plan will never be promised and fulfilled on the righteousness of any earthly king except one. That's what I was trying to say. And that one who comes is, interestingly, the iniquity of us all will be placed on that king, But then he's the one who deals with the sin that's placed on him. That's the coming Messiah. So in that act, and Paul obviously writes in Romans chapter 5 about this. This is the atonement that I would argue extends to the entire, all of humanity with regards to this particular act. Through one man, sin, that's Adam, but then through one, namely Christ, comes the solution to that problem. All right, let's keep going. Bathsheba's son Solomon is going to be the fourth son of David. And it's interesting, in the early stages here, we're going to see sibling rivalry kind of creep in, not unlike what we saw in the Joseph narrative between brothers. And there's going to be interesting early on conflict in the chapters that follow. And here we're going to have, we won't cover it in too much detail, but we're going to have, after the rape of Tamar, Absalom is going to take revenge against Amnon, and Amnon's going to be executed. We see that in chapter 13, verse 28. Let's take a look at that. And let's have, over here, let's have Chris. Could you read that, please? Chapter 13, verse 28. Oh, not here? Oh, okay. Sorry. How about Mark? I know you're here.
Yes. Okay. Which one? 13, what verses?
Verse 28. Chapter 13, verse 28.
28. Then Absalom commanded his servants, Mark, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not fear. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant.
Okay, so we're going to have... So here we've got one of the royal sons killed, and Absalom will incite a conspiracy now against his father in chapter 15. Why don't you keep reading there in verses 1 through 6? So we're not through with Absalom.
1 through 6.
Yes, sir.
After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And when he said, "Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel," Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." And Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were a judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." And whenever a man came to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him.
Yes. Okay, that's fine. Just verse 5 there. So what's he trying to do here? You see him starting to act, and here he is a little bit of deception going on here. He's trying to be and act like king. He's taking over the role as king, trying to turn hearts and minds here towards his way. This is going to lead to another conflict. So we're going to have Absalom and his army, and they're called, in reference here, the men of Israel, which is a subtle way of saying the men of the north. David's men are going to be under the command of Joab. And we're going to see Absalom's army will be defeated, and he ends up abandoned by his mule on the battlefield. And he gets stuck in an oak tree, of all places, over here in chapter 18. Moving kind of fast here, sorry. So Absalom is now stranded on the battlefield, verse 6 through 10 in chapter 18. Let's have Joe. Could you read? Where are you? Joe,
6 through what?
Oh, yeah, there you are. Chapter 18, 6 through 10.
So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. And his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, "Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak."
Yeah, kind of a comical picture. Unfortunately, it does not end well for Absalom. We're going to see over in verse 14, Joab is going to intervene. He says, "I will not waste time here with you." So he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. So Joab's going to end it right there. And this is tragic. David's going to grieve the loss of yet another son. And in chapter 18, verses 32 through 33. Joe, keep reading that, verse 32 and 33.
The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord and king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man." And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom.
Okay, go ahead.
I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son."
He's grieving, so that's kind of tragic for the king. So this is, keep going here through David's life. You look at the whole of King David, and he has such a high point, and early on, I mean, we saw, last couple weeks, we were contrasting David with Saul. Saul's on the decline, David's on the rise. His victory on the battlefield of Goliath, and the early victories in his involvement in serving the house of Saul. Even though he's running for his life, he spares Saul's life, and then finally he becomes, finally the one true king after Saul's tragic death. But he continues to rise, military victory, and then the Davidic covenant, the high point, and then from this point on, and after his sin with Bathsheba, we see this, kind of this subtle, and slow decline. It's a bit chaotic in his household, and we continue to see, tragedy after tragedy. What we see at the end in David, his older life, it's very interesting. Near the end of David's life, he's going to have yet further conflicts, I would point out, with the Nephilim. They show up again, the giants. And it's interesting. I don't know if you've ever looked at this passage before. There's going to be more than one. And they show up. Like the Amalekites, we argued, there's this, they just keep showing up in opposition to the Lord's agenda. And let's take a look at chapter 21. Near the end of David's life. As an old man, chapter 21, things are going to be a bit different now with regards to this battle. Chapter 21, verse 15. Let's see. Adam, where are you? I know you're here. Could you read for us in chapter, that 21 chapter, and then verse 15 and 16?
Now when the Philistines were at war again with Israel, David went down and his servants with him, and as they fought against the Philistines, David became weary. Then Ishbosheth, who was among the descendants of the giant, the weight of whose spear was 300 shekels of bronze in weight, was girded with new sword, and he intended to kill David.
There he is, one of those giants. And you can make the case with regards to who this is a descendant of. The term giant there is an interpretation of the Hebrew Raphaim. There might be a connection there, so it's interesting. But the case for the idea of giant comes with this whole ending section here. These are some tall warriors that show up in opposition to, and I want to take on the create the opposition against the advancement of the Lord's agenda. And 3 giants later, in this context, we see Jonathan. This is going to be David's nephew, defeat, as he's described, a 6-fingered and 6-toed giant from Gath. And that's in verse 20 and 21. And there was a war at Gath again, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, as if we couldn't do the math. And he also had been born to the giant. And when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These were 4, that is, giants born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. So the difference is, David runs out on the battlefield. Certainly he's there to oppose, but he needs a little help from his friends because he's older in age. So that's what we have going on here. Maybe because of David's first example, hey, we know we can do this too. Take on these giants, these giant warriors who are in opposition. David was the first. Now we're following his example when he was a little younger. So it's kind of an interesting account. But out of the difficulties and pressures that we have, and as they were experienced by King David, and he's approaching the end of his life, David, I think reveals again as a songwriter, there's another song that he writes, rich in theology, and he's leaving this again as a deposit for his kingdom. And it's going to focus I've got one of those updates are available showing up on my monitor here. Sorry, that was a computer interruption. I got to X out of this. Okay, sorry about that. So Second Samuel 22 is this whole psalm. I just want to focus on bits and pieces of it because it focuses on the Lord, on the victory of the Lord over his enemies. But we see a window into David's whole heart, I think, showing up here. He's going to recognize who it was and who offered him victory over the years of victories. And that starts, let's look at verse 16 through 19. And see Austin in the front here. 16 through 19.
Then the channels of the sea appeared, the foundations of the world were laid bare, by the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. He sent from on high, he took me. He drew me out of many waters, he delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who had hated me, for they were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He also brought me forth into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. The Lord...
You want me to just pause there? So that's good. That's down through verse 19. So, there's, in poetic fashion, there's, the one who appeared before the foundations of the world, who is the creator. He's king. He's also the one who's the same, who delivered military victory for me, rescued me from strong enemies and all of the things that are listed there. But that's just one of the theological high points of this song. We're encouraged by David's words in verse 20 through 25. I'll read those there. He also brought me forth into a broad place and rescued me because he delighted in me. The Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he has recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not acted wickedly against my God. For all of his ordinances were before me. And as for his statutes, I did not depart from them. I was also blameless toward him, and I kept myself from iniquity. Therefore the Lord has recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness, my cleanness before his eyes. Wait a minute. Is that true? That's not, wait a minute. I mean, is he kind of pulling what would he say, the carpet over it? I don't know what the cliche is. Pulling whatever. How do we think about this particular part of this psalm? How can he honestly say that as David, that the Lord has recompensed him according to his righteousness, right? We know that David was not sinlessly perfect. Nobody is, but neither was Abraham, right? So let's, in verse 24 and 25, let's look at that verse again. I'm trying to solve my own problem that I've created, or not necessarily my problem. It's here in the text. So we have to do the work of interpretation to kind of get our heads around this. If you've ever been challenged with this particular passage, it's not one of those sticky wickets. I just want to kind of highlight, I think, what was clearly on David's mind and heart as he wrote this song, which he got his theology correct at this point. If we want to compare this situation, if we go all the way back to Genesis chapter 17, let's go back there as a way of reminder. As I mentioned Abraham, we know in the life of the patriarch Abraham, Genesis chapter 17, verse 1. Now when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I'm El Shaddai, God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. And I'll establish my covenant between me and you, and I'll multiply you exceedingly. And in just a few verses, wait a minute. The other verse that's kind of a parallel verse to that is over here in chapter 15 with regards to Abraham. And that's the passage where Abraham believed in the Lord and it was credited to him as righteousness. So the combination in the person of Abraham, we see this idea of being, this connection of walking before God and being blameless. The Hebrew word there means, it's kind of a broad term, but it can also mean the idea of being whole or complete. So it's not necessarily a word that always means in every context this idea of being perfect or blameless. I prefer the translation to be whole and complete, because that's, well, not just because, but it's interesting that it parallels the idea of David having and being referred to as a man after God's own heart. The whole heart idea, David recognizes to have a whole heart. It's the idea that we keep going back to, where I draw the picture of what it looks like. It's this picture. It shows up in Abraham. So to have a whole heart like Abraham, is to have the heart full or complete or whole. And that's the idea of that we see in, if we go back to 2 Samuel, I was also whole toward him, and I kept myself from iniquity. Not sinlessly perfect, but as a way of life, as a lifestyle. I walked wholly with a heart full, with feet attached. Therefore the Lord has recompensed me according to my righteousness, because by faith, right, Abraham was declared righteous in response. David understood that as well. It's not my righteousness, but it's the righteousness. Perhaps we can make a case that, we've got a little bit of David recognizing my situation is just like Abraham's, with regards to how God referred to me, how he recognized me, how he saw me through the divine lens. I'm in the same faith position as Abraham, who's the father of faith. I think that's what might be behind, kind of like in the backdrop of David's reflection here in writing this song down. So again, we see the idea of being blameless with the whole over in verse 26. With the kind, you show yourself kind, where the idea is they're loyal, is verse 26. So with the loyal, you show yourself loyal, O Lord, and with the whole, not necessarily sinlessly perfect, with the whole, you show yourself whole, in verse 26. That's the idea. It's the same word, blameless, that I talked about over in verse 24. All right. And it's important to remind ourselves that Paul is also the one who uses the example given to us in Abraham, the patriarch, in his first century church argument with regards to justification by faith alone. So I just wanted to kind of connect all that together for us. Like I said earlier, it's interesting. Occasionally I'll run into somebody in my church that has been told all their life that, there were no saved people in the Old Testament. It's this really crazy lunatic idea keeps showing up. David's certainly modeling to us here. He's not only knows of his salvation, but he's worshiping out of the foundation of knowing that he's saved. And he's in right relationship before God. Even in the midst of his rocky road, right? His warts and all life. No different than Abraham that we saw before. All right. David's also recognizing in this song, in verse 44 and 45, some interesting things with regards to the nations. You or thou, mine kind of goes a little bit King James, but thou hast also delivered me from the contentions of my people. Thou hast kept me as head of the nations. A people whom I have not known serve me. Foreigners pretend obedience to me. As soon as they hear, they obey me. So there's implications that David lays out here with regards to his rulership in terms of as they relate to the nations. There's some connections that David's making. Finally, he concludes with a focus on the seed and this idea of the anointed one in verses 47 through 51. Let's have Daniel. There you are. Okay. Read let's see, 47 through 51.
The Lord lives. Praise be to my rock. Exalted be my God, the rock, my Savior. He is the God who avenges me, who puts the nations under me, who sets me free from my enemies. You exalted me above my foes. From a violent man you rescued me. Therefore I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing the praises of your name. He gives his king great victories. He showed unfailing kindness to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever.
Okay, so there's a lot of theology packed in these, just these three last few verses here, as this psalm, you might say, ends with the climax of the fireworks display. That's the way I see it. You see some hints here so that kind of go back to, if we remember, Hannah's song that we first saw in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10, as she refers to the anointed one, which is really the idea of the Messiah, Mashiach, the anointed one who's coming. We're going to see here in these last few verses the idea of descendants there in verse 51. Really, that's a translation of the Hebrew word seed. So here again, David and to David and his seed forever. So this idea of the seed. So that goes back to the Davidic covenant and Nathan's oracle to King David. What was promised eternally, that this anointed one would come through the seed of David. David's line, it's going to be, that's the end. That's the last one. That this king is coming through the seed of David. So all of this becomes a reason for celebration. And here, in this last verse, verse 51, what's interesting there, does your translation supply the word he in the translation? It's probably maybe put in italics because it's not there in the Hebrew, but it's interesting. The fact that it's not there in the Hebrew can sometimes bring emphasis, because what you do is you supply it in your own reading of it, and it's almost like an emphatic assumption. He, meaning God, right, is a tower of deliverance to his king. So the parallelism comes from his king, and then we supply the first person singular pronoun, third person singular pronoun, he, to connect to the him in terms of the parallelism. So he is a tower, God is a tower of deliverance to his king, and shows covenant loyalty to his Messiah, there in verse 51, to David and his seed forever. That's how it should read. That pulls it all together. David's song is the celebration of that slide that I showed earlier. That which is pointing ahead. The forever, forever, hallelujah, hallelujah is right there. That's what we talked about, right? The hallelujah chorus, the forever word. That's why we have it. That's why it's so emphatic. So it comes from David's, one of his, here, not the very last song, but the second to the last song that we have. And then the very last song in chapter 23, it's a little shorter, but over here in, verse 5, chapter 23, verse 5, says, "Truly is not my house so with God, for he has made an everlasting covenant with me, ordered in all things and secured. For all my salvation and all my desire will he not indeed make it grow." That reference there to the idea of to grow is another idea that's going to find some headlines in coming authors, namely the prophets. And in the Hebrew, behind that, will he not make it grow, is the idea of, literally, verse 5 should be translated, cause to sprout up, is the idea. And that's going to lay the theological foundation for this sprouting idea that's going to show up in the prophets. So I'll jump ahead to, if you want to turn with me to Jeremiah chapter 23. And this is where the prophets get their theology. I call it the theology of the sprout, or the root, or the small branch, the branch idea. Jeremiah starts in chapter 23. There we go, verse 5. There we go. It's the theology of the branch, or the Hebrew word, or the idea is that this idea of the sprout. You see it there in verse 5. "Behold, the days are coming," this is Jeremiah 23, verse 5, "declares the Lord, when I shall raise up for David a righteous branch." That's the connection. That connects back to David's very, very, very last song that we just read. So this idea of causing an indeed to grow or sprout up, that's the question that David raises in his last song. The prophets are going to find their answer. This is the branch or the sprout that he talks about. And he will reign as king and act wisely, Jeremiah says, and do justice and righteousness in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved. Israel will dwell securely. By the way, that's why I believe in a future for Israel, things like that. And in this, his name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness. So that's the beginning of the branch theology. We're going to see that again in chapter 33, verse 15, and Zechariah chapter 3, verse 8, Isaiah chapter 4, verse 2, probably the more well-known branch reference. All of these prophets are going to take that from David's theological reflection on the Davidic covenant, and it's the implications through his seed, one would come, the anointed one. Well, he's also going to sprout up. That assumes maybe that there's going to be some kind of a destruction layer before the sprouting actually occurs. So that's the idea. The tree is cut. That's what the prophets are going to say. The nation will fall. Judah and Israel will cease to exist as a nation because they lose their land, they lose their king, and they lose their temple. When you do that to a nation, you kill it in the ancient world. So how we're going to find life on these dry bones, Ezekiel asks. The answer is Davidic covenant and this idea of that which is ashes, dry and dead, is going to find life again. There's going to be a miraculous raising up. That's the resurrection of, all of this kind of ties together. So the coming king is the sprout. All right. Well, we're not done with David. Yep, go ahead.
This is Messianic prophesy, right? The king is Jesus, right?
Yeah, the Messiah. Mm-hmm.
NASB version said.
Wait, what verse are you in?
Second Samuel.
2 Samuel 23:5.
Chapter 3.
Okay.
Verse 51 said, David and all his descendants is a plural, not singular. Descendants mean not singular, plural. So this is not Jesus kind of.
Chapter 23, verse 5.
Yeah. No. 2 Samuel chapter 23, 51, verse. It says, you give great victory to your king, you show unfailing love to your anointed, to David, and Jesus, right?
Okay, come up to me at break, and I want you to ask this so we can look at it together in the text, okay? And then I'll bring it back to class after break. Is that okay? Okay, thanks. One last thing I want to show you before break here. What's interesting in let's see, where are we here? Oh, I just lost my place, right? Sorry. So we were in Second Samuel here at the end. So we were in, there we go. What's interesting in chapter 23, after David's last song, we have a little bit of a list. David's going to list out his mighty men. And there's even theology in this list, I'll argue. And if you look at the very end of the list of his mighty men, that begins kind of a recollection of some of the military exploits of his mighty men, and then he starts to list each one all the way down to verse 39. Uriah is listed last. Isn't that interesting? And paying proper respect, I think, to the one who David probably knew he did wrong to, but he's last in the list. 37 in all. 37 mighty men were listed in this group of loyal soldiers who fought along David through all of those years. Let's take a break, and we'll come back in 10 minutes. All right?